You're a guy with a camera. I'm the guy who decides if your deaf kid gets her surgery. Now pick up the glass." Those were the exact words Sterling screamed right before he shoved me backward into a table of champagne flutes. I can still feel the precise, violent, kinetic energy of his palms striking the center of my chest. I was 34 years old. The impact forced the air out of my lungs in a sharp, involuntary hiss. I flew backward, my polished dress shoes losing their grip on the slick, cold marble of the Calhoun Beach Club floor. My spine collided with the edge of a high-top table draped in heavy ivory linen. And then, gravity took over. The sound of the glass breaking was a deafening, crystalline explosion, a sharp cascade that sounded like a chandelier dropping directly onto concrete. I hit the floor hard, my knees jarring against the unforgiving stone. A shower of shattered crystal rained down on my arms and shoulders. The immediate wet sting of glass slicing into the meaty, calloused parts of both my palms made me gasp. My favorite lens, a $4,000 Nikon 70 to 200 millimeter that had taken me 2 years to save for, detached from the camera body and shattered cleanly down the middle, the convex glass cracking with a sickening crunch. The ballroom, previously humming with the low, elegant murmur of a string quartet and the polite laughter of old money, went dead silent. 200 wealthy guests watched me. I could smell the sharp, acidic tang of spilled brut champagne mixing with the metallic scent of my own blood pooling on the white marble. Nobody moved. Women in backless silk gowns clutched their beaded evening bags. Men in bespoke tuxedos stared at me with detached, clinical curiosity. Why isn't anyone moving? I thought, the panic rising in my throat like bile. I'm bleeding. I'm literally bleeding on the floor, and they are just staring. Nobody helped. 3 weeks later, a barista at Spy House Coffee in Minneapolis overheard a specific name. And that single, totally random overheard name was the key to tearing Sterling's life apart, down to the studs. But by then, it was way too late for him to apologize. My name is Elias Caldwell. I'm a single dad, and for 8 years, I was a wedding photographer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That wasn't my grand life ambition. I didn't grow up dreaming of taking pictures of drunken groomsmen doing the Macarena in dimly lit VFW halls, smelling of stale beer and cheap cologne. I grew up in a tiny, drafty duplex in northeast Minneapolis, raised mostly by my grandfather, Leo. The duplex was a sensory time capsule. The floors slanted slightly to the west, groaning underfoot, and the cast-iron radiators clanked and hissed in the brutal winter months like men with hammers trapped inside the pipes. Grandpa Leo was a diesel mechanic. His hands were permanently stained black around the knuckles. The grease worked so deeply into the microscopic cracks of his skin that no amount of pumice soap could scrub it away. He smelled faintly, always, of raw motor oil, Old Spice, and strong, bitter black coffee. He wasn't a talkative man, but he was a terrifyingly watchful one. He used to sit on our sagging wooden porch in the heavy, humid summer evenings, smoking a cherrywood pipe, just watching the cars go by on University Avenue. The glowing ember of the pipe would flare orange in the twilight. He had this one saying. I heard it maybe 50 times before I turned 18. I remember being 12, frustrated to the point of tears trying to force a stripped bolt off a rusted lawnmower deck. I was pulling on the wrench with all my meager body weight, my face flushed hot with anger. You're forcing it, Eli, Leo had said, stepping out onto the grass, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It's stuck, Grandpa, I shot back, panting, wiping sweat from my forehead. I need the mower working today. I promised Mrs. Gable. Leo knelt down, his bad knees popping in the quiet yard. He took a small can of penetrating oil, sprayed a quick burst onto the corroded metal, and gently took the wrench from my trembling hands. A rusted bolt breaks if you yank it, he said softly, looking me dead in the eye. Let the oil soak. I don't have time to let it soak, I whined. Time is exactly what you have, he replied, tapping the side of my head with a greasy finger. Patience is what you lack. You wait. You let the pressure do the work for you. Then, the metal yields. I didn't really understand the profound weight of what that meant until I had to entirely dismantle a human being. My adult life was entirely structured around one person. My daughter, Maya. Maya was 7 years old during the year this story takes place. She was born profoundly deaf in both ears. Her mother, my college girlfriend, couldn't handle the crushing daily reality of special needs parenting. The endless doctor's appointments, the specialized therapies, the crying in the night that we couldn't easily soothe. She packed her bags when Maya was 10 months old. I came home to an apartment that smelled of empty space and a brief note on the kitchen island. I haven't seen her since. It was just me and Maya, navigating a loud, chaotic world that simply wasn't built for us. We communicated mostly through American Sign Language. Her silence wasn't empty. It was a physical presence in our home, a quiet sanctuary. Maya was a brilliant, funny, terrifyingly observant kid. She loved painting with thick, messy watercolors. She loved large, goofy dogs. And she loved sitting on my shoulders when we walked around the Minneapolis lakes, her small hands gripping my hair, the cool autumn breeze flushing her cheeks pink. But the financial reality of our lives was a constantly tightening noose. The medical bills for her speech therapy, her vibrating alarms, her specialized sensory equipment, and the massive savings fund I was desperately trying to build for her upcoming bilateral cochlear implant surgery were suffocating me. The physical weight of the stress lived in my shoulders, a permanent burning knot of tension. The surgery and the subsequent aggressive auditory therapy were going to cost me entirely out of pocket, because my awful bottom-tier freelance insurance wouldn't cover the specific world-class specialist we needed at the university hospital. I needed $60,000. It felt like needing to capture the moon in a jar. That's why I shot weddings. It paid well if you got in with the right crowd, the kind of crowd that didn't blink at dropping 10 grand on imported peonies. My superpower, if you want to call it that, is absolute invisibility. People do not look at the photographer. They look at the black glass of the camera lens. I am essentially a piece of furniture that occasionally flashes. Because nobody looks at me, nobody filters themselves around me. I hear every vicious, whispered argument in the bridal suite while I pretend to adjust my ISO. I see the mother-in-law rolling her eyes at the bride's dress. I notice when the groom spends a little too much time talking to the maid of honor in the darkened hallway near the bathrooms, the scent of their mingled perfumes lingering in the air. I remember everything people say, and I notice the things they carelessly leave behind. That one thing about me? It's the reason this story has the ending it does. And then I met Sterling Croft. And for the first time in my life, I thought I'd found my golden ticket out of my suffocating financial panic. I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong. Sterling was the premier luxury wedding planner in the Twin Cities. If you were a local politician, a professional hockey player, or a real estate heir, Sterling planned your wedding. He was 42, perfectly, unnaturally tanned in the middle of a brutal gray Minnesota winter, always wearing custom Italian suits that draped perfectly and cost more than my used Honda Civic. He smelled intensely of bergamot, cedarwood, and expensive gin. We met at an exclusive vendor showcase at the Guthrie Theater. The amber lighting of the Dowling studio cast long, dramatic shadows across the room. The air smelled of floor wax and the rich, buttery scent of catered hors d'oeuvres. I was packing up my gear, totally ignored by the high-end crowd sipping champagne, when he walked over. His leather shoes made sharp, authoritative clicks on the hardwood. "Your lighting is aggressive," he said, not bothering to introduce himself. He just picked up one of my heavy, leather-bound sample albums and flipped through the thick matte pages. "Excuse me?" I asked, pausing with a light stand in my hand. "I didn't stutter," Sterling said, his eyes scanning a black-and-white portrait of a bride crying. "It's aggressive. You don't soften the shadows. You don't blow out the highlights to make them look like angels. But your composition is ruthless. You don't take pretty pictures, Elias. You take honest ones." "I prefer honest," I said, zipping my canvas bag with a loud final rip of the zipper. "Pretty fades. Honest lasts." "Honest pays terrible," Sterling replied, dropping the heavy book back on the table with a loud thud. He finally looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating. "I have 3 weddings next month. Minimum budget is 200,000 each. My usual photographer just went to rehab for a cocaine problem. You want the contracts? I don't know, I said cautiously, my heart performing a sudden, violent flutter in my chest. I usually work direct with clients. You work for me now, he said, pulling a sleek black business card from his breast pocket and flicking it onto my table. My fee is a 20% agency cut. You'll still clear triple what you make now. Call my assistant by noon tomorrow, or I find someone else. Just like that, my income tripled. The first 6 months were a blinding blur of absurd, sickening luxury. I was shooting at sprawling private estates on Lake Minnetonka, massive winter galas with towering, intricate ice sculptures that wept cold water onto the floor, and destination elopements in snow-covered chalets. I was making more money than I ever had in my life. I started padding Maya's medical fund aggressively. For the first time in 7 years, the iron bands of anxiety around my chest began to loosen. I could actually breathe when I looked at my bank account on my phone. I completely ignored the warning signs because the massive checks cleared. Looking back, the red flags weren't flags. They were a parade with marching bands and fireworks. First, it was the phone. We'd be having a vendor dinner at Spoon and Stable, surrounded by the rich scent of dry-aged ribeye and truffle oil, and the second his phone buzzed, he'd flinch. He'd flip it face down on the heavy mahogany table with a loud, sharp smack. Just the ex-wife, he'd lie, waving his hand dismissively. I knew from his assistant that he wasn't married, and never had been. Then came the passwords. He made every vendor sign these draconian, 50-page non-disclosure agreements. Privacy for the high-profile clients, he claimed smoothly. But he also required us to use a specific, highly encrypted messaging app hosted on foreign servers just to discuss mundane details like floral arrangements and catering timelines. I told myself it was just eccentric rich guy behavior. It wasn't nothing. Then, the sudden violent mood swings. 1 minute he was buying the whole table a round of $300 champagne, raising his glass and calling us his beautiful creative family. The next, he was viciously, systematically tearing down a florist to her face. She was a sweet older woman named Beatrice. We were doing a venue walkthrough. Sterling took one look at the centerpieces she had spent 4 hours arranging. "What is this?" Sterling asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadpan whisper. "They're the blue hydrangeas the bride requested, Sterling," Beatrice said, nervously wiping her hands on her apron. Sterling reached out and crushed one of the delicate blue blooms in his fist. He let the bruised petals drop to the floor. "These hydrangeas are the color of poverty, Beatrice. They look like they were purchased at a gas station by a grieving widower. Get them out of my sight, or I will ruin your business by lunchtime." Beatrice actually cried. I just stood there, adjusting my camera strap, feeling sick to my stomach, but I said nothing. The major fracture happened in early November. We were wrapping up a massive, exhausting reception at the Landmark Center in St. Paul. I was dead on my feet, my lower back screaming in protest, my shoulders aching with a deep, burning fire from carrying 2 heavy camera bodies for 14 straight hours. The air inside the venue was stifling, smelling of stale sweat, spilled beer, and melting cake icing. I went out to the exterior catering tent to grab a glass of ice water. The November air outside was freezing, biting through my thin, sweat-drenched dress shirt. Sterling was standing in the deep shadows near the loading dock, illuminated only by the harsh yellow glow of a single sodium street lamp. He was talking to a guy I didn't recognize, a guy wearing a cheap leather jacket and chewing on a toothpick. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I just wanted water. I froze behind a stack of empty folding chairs. "I don't care how you route it," Sterling was hissing, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The bank is asking questions about the volume," the man in the leather jacket muttered. "Then put it through Caldwell's Vendor LLC, Sterling snapped, his voice dripping with venomous contempt. "He's an idiot. He just clicks the button on the invoice and takes the check. The 247 needs to clear by Tuesday, or we are completely screwed with the Cayman's account." My stomach dropped into a bottomless abyss. A cold sweat broke out across my hairline, instantly freezing in the winter air. The plastic water bottle slipped slightly in my trembling, sweaty hand, making a faint crinkling sound. 247? My Vendor LLC? What is he talking about? Before my panicked brain could process the information, Sterling turned sharply and saw me standing there. His eyes went dead and flat, like a shark that just smelled copper in the water. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. I could hear my own heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribs. But then, the mask snapped back into place. He smiled, that perfect, terrifying, predatory smile. "Elias!" he called out, his voice suddenly booming and cheerful. "You look dead on your feet, buddy. Go home. Kiss your kid. We're done here." "Yeah," I croaked, my throat tight and dry. "Just getting water. See you, Sterling." I nodded, keeping my eyes down, and practically ran to my car. That was the night I sat in the dark of my apartment, opened my business banking portal, and actually looked deeply at the transaction history for the first time. What I found, I still can't say it out loud without my hands shaking and my chest tightening. There were massive, inexplicable deposits, tens of thousands of dollars, money that came into my account from a generic payment processor and was automatically routed out exactly 3 hours later to a holding company I had never heard of. Sterling had quietly set up an automated clearinghouse sweep on the account he forced me to use for vendor payments when I signed my initial contract. I was laundering money. Without knowing it, without consenting to it, I was the primary domestic wash for a massive financial crime. If the IRS looked, Elias Caldwell wasn't a photographer. Elias Caldwell was a high-level felon. I should have gone to the police right then. I should have picked up the phone and called the FBI. But I panicked. If I blew the whistle, Sterling would cut me off instantly. He would ruin my reputation, bury me in expensive litigation, and with his connections, maybe even pin the whole operation on me. I needed his money for Maya's surgery, which was finally scheduled for April. I had no other income source that could quickly cover the remaining $60,000. So, I stayed quiet. I swallowed the bile and the terror. And because I stayed quiet, Sterling realized he owned me. He knew that I knew, and he knew that I wouldn't do a damn thing about it. And that's when the cruelty really began. It started small. Phase 4. The escalation. Beat 1 was the blatant disrespect at a tasting event in late November. We were in a high-end bakery in Edina. The air was thick and warm, smelling overpoweringly of proofing yeast, vanilla bean, and dark espresso. Sterling was sitting at a marble table, meeting with a bride and groom. I was circling the table, taking candid, documentary-style shots of them laughing over cake samples. I paused for 10 seconds to pop out a full memory card and insert a fresh one. Sterling stopped mid-sentence, turned his head slowly, looked directly at me, and literally snapped his fingers. Snap, snap. The sound cut through the quiet bakery like a gunshot. "Elias," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Less lingering, more shooting." "I'm changing a card, Sterling," I said quietly. "I don't care if you're changing your underwear," he replied, not breaking eye contact. "You're hovering like a waiter waiting for a tip. It's distracting. Do your job." The bride laughed nervously, covering her mouth. The groom smirked and took a sip of his coffee. I felt my face burn with a sudden, intense heat, a flush of pure humiliation. But I just swallowed the lump in my throat, nodded, and raised the heavy camera back to my eye. I had the emotional range of a parking meter in those moments. Survive. Just survive for Maya. Beat 2 was control. 2 weeks later, I had a critical, long-awaited audiology appointment for Maya. It was the final mapping session before we signed the surgical consent forms. I had told Sterling about this appointment a month in advance, in writing. At 8 a.m., the morning of the appointment, as I was pouring Maya a bowl of cereal, my phone rang. "I need you at the venue in Wayzata in an hour," Sterling barked, skipping any greeting. "Sterling, I can't," I said, a tight, suffocating band of panic wrapping around my ribs. "I told you, Maya has her specialist today. We've waited 4 months for this slot." "Elias," his voice dropped to a terrifying, quiet whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Do you think these clients care about your domestic issues?" "It's my daughter's surgery prep, Sterling." "Because apparently," he continued, ignoring my plea. Keeping this extremely lucrative job isn't enough of a commitment for you. Be here by 9, or I'll find someone who actually wants to work, and you can figure out how to pay your own bills. He hung up. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen, the phone trembling in my hand, staring at Maya, who was happily eating her Cheerios in total silence. I had to call my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, begging her to take Maya to the clinic. When I explained to Maya in ASL that Daddy couldn't come to the doctor, her face crumbled. She cried, silent, heavy tears rolling down her cheeks. I felt a physical nausea, like I was the worst father on the face of the earth. I drove through the snow to Wayzata, my stomach tied in knots, only to find out Sterling just wanted me to take test shots of a new complex lighting rig he had rented. It took exactly 10 minutes. He made me miss my daughter's critical appointment for a 10-minute lighting test just to prove that he could. Beat 3 was the replacement threat. Sterling started bringing a 22-year-old kid named Jackson to the weddings. Jackson smelled aggressively of cheap vape smoke and arrogant confidence. He had a shiny new mirrorless camera and absolutely no idea how to light a dark room, but Sterling loudly, performatively praised him all night. "Look at this framing, Elias," Sterling would say, grabbing my shoulder and pointing at the back of Jackson's camera screen. "This is hunger. You've lost your hunger. You're getting soft." "The subject is entirely out of focus, Sterling," I pointed out quietly. "It's artistic," Sterling sneered. "Something you used to understand before you became a machine. Watch your back, Elias. The kid is cheaper than you." He wanted me permanently terrified of losing my income. Beat 4 was the spatial violation. This one made me physically, violently sick to my stomach. I rented a small, cheap studio space in northeast Minneapolis for editing photos and the occasional client meeting. Sterling had the security code because he sometimes had staging equipment dropped there when his warehouse was full. One Tuesday afternoon, I came to the studio with Maya to do some editing while she painted. I punched in the door code and pushed it open. The unmistakable, pungent odor of stale sweat and cheap, cloying vanilla body mist hit my nostrils instantly. Sterling was sitting on my leather client sofa, casually buttoning his crisp white dress shirt. A bridesmaid from the previous weekend's wedding, a woman I vaguely recognized, was hastily pulling her cocktail dress up over her shoulders in the corner of the room. Her face flushed red. "Sterling?" I said, my voice cracking. I immediately turned Maya around by her shoulders, pushing her back out into the cold hallway. "What the hell are you doing?" Sterling didn't even look embarrassed. He calmly tucked his shirt in, walked over to my desk, and grabbed a peppermint from the glass bowl. "Hey, buddy," he said, popping the mint into his mouth. "Needed a quiet place off the radar. Didn't think you'd be here." "This is my business space," I hissed, my fists clenching at my sides. "My daughter is out there." "Relax," Sterling chuckled, completely devoid of shame. "Take the kid for ice cream. I need the room for another 20 minutes to finish up some paperwork." He was treating my safe space, my professional sanctuary, like a cheap hourly motel. Beat 5 was the house visit. This is the moment the dynamic shifted from professional bullying to a direct, personal threat. Sterling showed up at my drafty duplex unannounced on a Sunday evening. The snow was falling heavily outside. He knocked loudly, and when I opened the door, he walked right past me without an invitation. He stood in the center of my modest living room, his expensive leather boots tracking melting snow onto my worn rug, and looked around with visible, theatrical disgust. "Rustic," he sneered, eyeing the peeling paint near the radiator. Maya was sitting at the small kitchen table, eating a bowl of macaroni and cheese. The scent of sharp cheddar and boiling pasta water filled the small room. She looked up at Sterling. "Kids have a radar for evil. They don't need context or language. They just know when a predator is in the room." "I need you to sign these updated vendor agreements," Sterling said, throwing a thick manila folder onto my kitchen table, narrowly missing Maya's milk glass. "Just legal housekeeping." "I'll read them and bring them to the office tomorrow," I said, my voice tight, stepping between him and my daughter. "You'll sign them now," he corrected, pulling a pen from his pocket. Maya watched him intensely. She put her fork down on the table with a soft clatter. She looked at me, her small hands coming up to her chest. Soft She signed 2 words rapidly, her facial expression severe. Bad man. Sterling frowned, noticing her hands moving out of the corner of his eye. What is she doing? What did she say? She said hello. I lied smoothly, though my heart was hammering a frantic, violent beat against my ribs. Right, Sterling said, clearly annoyed by her mere existence. Sign the papers, Elias, and tell her it's rude to aggressively wave her hands at people. It makes people uncomfortable. He walked out, slamming the front door so hard the framed photos on the wall rattled. I didn't sign the papers. I opened them, saw they contained a clause absolving his parent company of all financial liability for vendor routing, and shoved them deep into a junk drawer. Beat 6 was the ally attack. Sterling didn't operate his empire of cruelty alone. He had an assistant named Chloe. Chloe was 26, ruthlessly ambitious, and entirely devoted to Sterling's cult of personality. She dressed exactly like him, spoke with his exact inflections, and executed his dirty work with a smile. We were at a high society rehearsal dinner at the Minicata Club when Chloe cornered me by the dessert table. The air was filled with the clinking of demitasse spoons against porcelain and the sweet, sugary smell of spun sugar and chocolate ganache. You need to fix your attitude, Elias, she whispered, stepping uncomfortably close to me, her sharp acrylic nails tapping an erratic rhythm against a champagne flute. I don't know what you're talking about, Chloe, I said, adjusting the flash on my camera to avoid looking at her. I'm just doing my job. Sterling is doing you a massive, unprecedented favor keeping you around, she hissed, her smile never faltering for the guests walking by. Everyone in the office knows you're just a charity case. I stopped breathing. The string quartet music in the room faded into a dull, rushing roar in my ears. Excuse me? I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You heard me, she smiled, a cold, dead expression reaching only her lips, not her eyes. You think you're special because you take moody photos? Please, we know about your financial mess. We know about the broken kid. Stop acting like you're indispensable. You're a tripod we tolerate. A broken kid. The words echoed in my skull. My vision swam with red-hot rage, my hands gripping the camera so tightly my knuckles turned white, but I turned and walked away. Beat 7 was the exile, the public humiliation regarding my basic human needs. It was a freezing Friday in mid-December. We were shooting a sprawling 12-hour corporate holiday wedding at a converted industrial warehouse. It was 10 degrees below zero outside. At 7 p.m., the vendor meal was finally served in a warm, heated back room. I hadn't eaten since 5 a.m. I was shivering, exhausted, and desperately hungry. I grabbed a plate and sat down with the band members. Sterling walked into the room, spotted me, and marched over. What are you doing? He demanded loudly, silencing the room. Eating, I said, holding up a piece of bread. It's my contracted 30-minute break. You're not a vendor tonight, Elias. You're a liability. You missed the shot of the CEO's toast, he lied, loud enough for the entire band to hear. Get up. Sterling, I'm freezing. I just need 10 minutes. Get up, he repeated, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Take your plate outside. You don't eat with the professionals until you learn to shoot like one. I looked around. The band members awkwardly looked down at their plates. Nobody defended me. I picked up my plate, my face burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical weight, and walked out the back door. I sat on a frozen concrete loading dock in 10-degree weather, my fingers so numb I could barely hold the metallic-tasting freezing turkey sandwich. I ate in the dark, shivering violently, tears of pure, impotent rage freezing on my cheeks. Beat 8 was the institutional threat. I had finally reached my breaking point. The next morning I called Sterling and told him I was done. I told him I wouldn't shoot the massive New Year's Eve gala he had planned for the mayor's daughter. Sterling didn't yell on the phone. He told me to meet him at a venue kitchen in downtown Minneapolis. When I arrived, the kitchen was empty, smelling sharply of industrial bleach, ozone, and rotting food from the commercial garbage bins. Sterling cornered me near the walk-in freezer. He stepped into my personal space and violently shoved me backward until my spine hit the heavy, cold stainless steel of a massive industrial refrigerator. Let's get something straight, he whispered, his breath hot against my face. You quit, and I will make sure you never shoot a wedding in the Midwest again. I will blacklist you so fast your head will spin." "I don't care," I choked out, trying to push him away, but he leaned his weight into me. "I'm done being your scapegoat." "Oh, you'll care," he smiled, a dark, venomous look in his eyes. "Because if you leave, I'll call Child Protective Services. I have friends in that office, Elias. Important friends. I'll tell them you're mentally unstable. I'll tell them you leave your deaf daughter alone at night in that squalid little duplex to go drinking. I'll say I've seen the neglect firsthand." I froze. The blood drained from my face. "Who are they going to believe?" Sterling taunted, tapping my chest with a manicured finger. "The guy who practically runs the economy of this city? Or a broke, desperate guy with a camera and a dirty house?" He was weaponizing my child. He was threatening to take away the only thing in the universe that mattered to me. Which brings us to beat 9, the detonator. The moment the rusted bolt finally snapped. It was the Winter Gala, mid-December, the Calhoun Beach Club, 200 high society guests. I was exhausted, stressed out of my mind, operating on 3 hours of sleep, and absolutely terrified of what Sterling would do to my family if I stepped out of line. I was walking backward, my eye pressed to the viewfinder, trying to get a wide, dynamic shot of the couple entering the grand ballroom. The music was loud. The lights were blinding. I didn't see Sterling standing directly behind me, hovering near the catering tables. I bumped into his shoulder. It was a light bump, a complete accident. "Sorry," I muttered, not lowering the camera. Sterling didn't just push me away. He planted his expensive shoes on the marble, reached out, grabbed the thick nylon front of my dual-camera harness, and violently, maliciously shoved me backward with every ounce of his strength. I flew backward, crashing into the high-top table covered in champagne flutes. The glass shattered everywhere. I hit the marble floor hard, the shards biting deep into my palms. My D850 smashed against the stone. The entire ballroom went dead silent. The music stopped abruptly. I sat there on the floor, gasping for air, the cold marble seeping into my bones. Blood started pooling on the white stone, bright red against the pristine surface. Sterling stood over me, calmly straightening his French cuffs. He looked down at me with absolute, unvarnished disgust. "You're a guy with a camera, Elias," he said, his voice projecting clearly, loud enough for the first 3 rows of wealthy guests to hear. "I'm the guy who decides if your deaf kid gets her surgery. Now pick up the glass." I looked around the room. 200 people. Wealthy, powerful, influential people. They all looked away. Some whispered behind their hands. Some took sips of their drinks. Nobody came to help me. Nobody told Sterling he was out of line. They were his enablers, completely bought and paid for by his extravagant parties and his social connections. It wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet, internal click deep inside my brain. The fear vanished. The anxiety evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. I slowly stood up, my knees shaking slightly. I wiped the wet blood from my hands onto the thighs of my dark trousers, leaving long, dark smears. I bent down, ignoring the pain in my palms, picked up my broken camera, unclipped my heavy harness, dropped it on the floor, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. I didn't cry. Not once. I saved every single tear for the day I'd watch him lose everything. Phase 5 began in the dark, quiet sanctuary of my apartment that night. I wrapped my bleeding hands in thick white gauze, wincing as the antiseptic stung the deep cuts. I walked into Maya's room. She was sleeping peacefully, her little chest rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm, her nightlight casting a warm blue glow over her face. I kissed her forehead. I went to my small desk, sat at my computer, and opened my massive, encrypted hard drives. What Sterling in all his arrogance didn't know was that I hadn't just been taking pictures of pretty brides and handsome grooms. I was fundamentally a documentary photographer. I took pictures of everything. And because nobody looks at the invisible guy with the camera, I had unhindered, unquestioned access to every room, every backstage staging area, every vendor tent, every private suite. I had high-resolution photos of the bank deposit slips Sterling carelessly left on catering tables. I had crystal-clear shots of the fraudulent tax documents he made Chloe sign when she thought nobody was looking. I had exact metadata timestamps of exactly when he was meeting with the stranger at the St. Paul loading dock. But I needed the missing piece. I had the puzzle, but I needed the box cover. I needed to know exactly where the money from my LLC was going after it left my bank. Enter the secret ally. Jax was going. Jax was the barista at Spy House Coffee in the North Loop. He was a 20-something kid with a silver nose ring, a thrifted cardigan, and a massive passion for vintage film photography. We used to chat about the chemical process of developing Kodak Tri-X film when I got my morning coffee. 3 weeks after the gala incident, I was sitting in the deep corner of the coffee shop, nursing a bitter black coffee, hiding behind a massive potted monstera plant, trying to figure out my next move. The air hissed with pressurized steam from the espresso machine. The bell on the door chimed. Sterling and Chloe walked in. They didn't see me in the shadows. They ordered their complicated drinks and stood at the far end of the wooden bar, talking in low, urgent voices. Jax was wiping down the chrome drip tray of the espresso machine right next to them, completely invisible to them, just a kid in an apron. After they grabbed their cups and left, Jax finished wiping the counter, untied his apron, and walked slowly over to my table. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder. "Hey, Elias," Jax said quietly, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "That guy, the one in the custom suit, that's your boss, right?" "Former boss," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Why?" "He's a piece of work," Jax muttered, leaning in close. He just told his assistant to make sure the wire transfer to Azure Holdings in the Caymans cleared before the quarterly audit. He was stressed. He said, and I quote, "If the correspondent bank flags the routing number again, blame the volume on Caldwell's LLC. Say it was a massive vendor payout for the spring quarter." My blood went cold. Then, a second later, it went blisteringly hot. Azure Holdings, the Caymans, a correspondent routing number. "Jax," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you absolutely sure he said Azure Holdings?" "100%, Jax nodded. I wrote it down on a napkin because it sounded like a Bond villain company. I stood up, threw a $20 bill on the table, and drove straight to my grandfather's house. Grandpa Leo was sitting in his worn leather armchair, the smell of old paper and cherry tobacco clinging to the room. He was watching the heavy snow fall outside the living room window. "Leo," I said, standing in the doorway, out of breath, my heart pounding. "I need your help. I need to borrow some of your retirement savings to hire a forensic accountant. Just for 1 hour. I promise I'll pay you back." Leo slowly turned his head. He looked at my bandaged hands, then looked at my wild, desperate eyes. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask for justification. He slowly stood up, walked to his heavy steel floor safe in the closet, spun the dial, pulled out a thick yellow envelope of cash, and handed it to me. "A rusted bolt breaks if you yank it," he said softly, quoting his oldest gospel. "Let the oil soak." "I've been soaking it for 6 months, Grandpa," I said, gripping the envelope tightly. "The oil has soaked through to the bone. It's time to turn the wrench." I used the cash to hire a guy named Miller. Miller wasn't a flashy billboard lawyer in a glass tower. He was a quiet, boring, meticulously organized accountant who worked out of a strip mall in Bloomington and specialized in offshore asset tracing for divorce cases. His office smelled of ozone from a constantly running laser printer and stale microwave popcorn. I sat across from his metal desk and handed him the printed photos of the deposit slips I had taken. I gave him the exact name, Azure Holdings. I gave him the specific, minute-by-minute dates of the automated clearinghouse sweeps from my bank account. It took Miller exactly 3 days. When I went back to his office, the fluorescent lights hummed loudly overhead. Miller pushed his thick glasses up the bridge of his nose and laid a massive, color-coded spreadsheet on the desk between us. "It's a classic correspondent bank scheme, Elias," Miller explained, tracing a line with a red pen. "He's washing dirty money, likely kickbacks from inflated vendor contracts, through your domestic LLC. He routes it through a correspondent bank in New York to legitimize the origin, and lands it safely in a blind trust in the Cayman Islands under the corporate shell name Azure Holdings. The total amount he's washed entirely through your name is exactly $247,500. It's felony wire fraud, Elias, and he's brilliantly set it up so you, the sole proprietor of the LLC, take the absolute fall if the feds ever audit. Can you prove it's him? I asked, my mouth dry. Can you prove I didn't authorize it? With these deposit slips? Miller tapped the photos. And the digital metadata on your raw photo files showing him physically, personally handling the transfer documents at the exact time the sweeps were initiated? Yes. The FBI would have a field day with this. It's a slam dunk. I thanked Miller, but I didn't go to the FBI. Not yet. I wanted Sterling to feel it. I wanted him to experience the exact same terrifying helplessness he had inflicted on me. I wanted him to lose his audience. Phase 6. The reversal. It was mid-February, the wedding of the year. The governor of Minnesota was marrying off his eldest daughter. It was a massive, millions of dollars blank check affair held at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Sterling had hired Jackson, the 22-year-old kid, to shoot it. But Jackson was terrified of the pressure of shooting politicians, and I still had the master login credentials to the museum's complex audiovisual system from a corporate gig I'd shot there the year before. I didn't sneak in through an alley. I walked right through the front door in a sharp black suit. I carried a clipboard. I looked like security. I looked like AV staff. I looked like nobody. The reception was in full, glorious swing. 300 guests, including state senators, local news anchors, local celebrities, and wealthy political donors. The sprawling, echoing halls were lined with priceless Renaissance tapestries and massive marble statues. The air smelled of hundreds of imported white lilies and old oil paintings. Sterling was at peak, unbearable smugness. He was standing on the grand marble staircase in a pristine white tuxedo jacket, holding a wireless microphone, physically basking in the warm, golden glow of the room. He was preparing to introduce the highly anticipated father of the bride's speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling's voice echoed smoothly through the massive hall, dripping with practiced charm. Creating a truly perfect moment is about trust. It's about a singular vision. And most importantly, it's about surrounding yourself with people who demand absolute, uncompromising excellence. I was standing in the darkened sound booth on the second-floor balcony, looking down at him through the thick glass. The actual AV guy had stepped out to the loading dock to smoke a cigarette. My hands weren't shaking. My heart wasn't racing. I was perfectly, terrifyingly calm. I took the small, encrypted flash drive from my pocket and plugged it directly into the main projection system's master port. "And now," Sterling announced, gesturing grandly with his free hand to the massive 80-foot blank projection wall towering above the staircase. "A special surprise slideshow presentation honoring our beautiful couple." He expected embarrassing baby photos. He expected romantic, sweeping drone footage of the couple walking through a vineyard. I clicked my mouse. I hit play. The room went completely dark. The massive screen flickered to blinding, brilliant life. It wasn't a photo of the blushing bride. It was a massive, high-definition, blown-up image of a bank wire transfer document. At the top, in bold, undeniable black letters, it read, "Azure Holdings, Cayman Islands, routing to S. Croft." A confused, low murmur rippled through the wealthy crowd. Sterling turned around slowly to look at the screen, his practiced smile freezing, turning brittle on his face. I clicked the mouse again. The slide transitioned. It was the photo I had taken from the freezing shadows of the St. Paul loading dock. It showed Sterling, his face clearly illuminated by the street lamp, handing a thick, unmistakable manila envelope of cash to the loading dock manager. The digital metadata timestamp was displayed in a massive, glaring red font across the bottom of the screen, verifying the exact date and time. "Hey, turn that off!" Sterling yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking, the smooth veneer instantly shattering. "We have technical difficulties. Cut the projector. Someone cut the power." He waved frantically at the sound booth. I didn't move. I clicked the mouse a third time. The slide transitioned again. It wasn't a photo this time. It was a green audio waveform pulsing on the screen. I had pulled the hidden security camera footage from my own small studio the day Sterling invaded it to sleep with the bridesmaid. The audio played through the massive, state-of-the-art concert speakers, booming through the museum. Put it through Caldwell's vendor LLC. He's an idiot. He just clicks the button and takes the check. The 247 needs to clear by Tuesday, or we are completely screwed with the Cayman's account. Sterling's own arrogant, cruel voice echoed off the marble walls, bouncing off the priceless art, filling the ears of every politician and donor in the room. The governor of Minnesota, sitting at the head table with a glass of champagne halfway to his mouth, slowly stood up. His face was thunderous, a mask of pure, unadulterated political fury. Sterling dropped the microphone. It hit the marble stairs with a deafening, agonizing squeal of feedback that made people cover their ears. His perfect artificial tan seemed to instantly drain away, leaving him looking gray, hollow, and visibly sick. His hands started shaking violently. He looked frantically up at the darkened sound booth, his eyes wide with a dawning, inescapable terror. I stepped up to the edge of the glass. The light from the projector caught my face. I looked down at him. I let him see me. I clicked the mouse one final time. The final slide appeared on the 80-foot screen. It was a beautifully lit, perfectly composed portrait of Maya. She was looking directly into the camera lens, her small hands up near her chest, signing two words with fierce intensity. Bad man. Underneath her photo, in massive plain white text, it read, $247,500 stolen from vendors. The police have the originals. Right on absolute cue, the heavy, intricately carved wooden doors of the museum ballroom swung open violently. 3 uniformed Minneapolis police officers and 2 men in cheap, off-the-rack suits, detectives from the Federal Financial Crimes Division, walked in, their badges flashing in the dim light. I had mailed them the entire, meticulously categorized packet of forensic evidence, certified mail, a week ago, timed perfectly for them to secure the arrest warrant this exact afternoon. Sterling's body language entirely collapsed. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He literally folded in on himself like a crushed can. He took a staggering step backward, almost tripping over the thick black microphone cord twisting around his expensive shoes. Chloe, his fiercely loyal assistant, took one look at the federal badges and immediately backed away from him. She practically sprinted toward the catering kitchen to physically distance herself from the blast radius. The wealthy guests, the exact same people who had casually watched me bleed on the floor months ago, sipping their drinks, stared at him in utter, revolted horror. They pulled their expensive coats tighter. They turned their backs. The lead detective walked briskly up the marble stairs, pulled out a heavy pair of steel handcuffs, and grabbed Sterling's perfectly tailored arm, twisting it roughly behind his back. I didn't stay to watch him cry. I didn't need to gloat. The debt was paid. I unclipped my fake security badge, left it sitting on the soundboard next to the flashing flash drive, and walked quietly down the concrete back stairwell. I pushed open the heavy metal exit door. The freezing, sharp winter air hit my face as I stepped out onto 3rd Avenue. The street was quiet, blanketed in fresh, untouched snow. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs. It felt incredible. It felt like freedom. Phase 7. The aftermath. The total collapse of Sterling Croft was a spectacular, highly publicized implosion. Within 2 weeks, his entire business apparatus was frozen and seized by federal authorities. You can't steal $250,000, forge tax documents, and route it offshore to the Caymans without catching the furious, undivided attention of the IRS and the FBI. Because the fraud was exposed so loudly, so publicly at the governor's daughter's wedding, Sterling instantly became a massive, toxic political liability. Nobody protected him. The wealthy elite of Minneapolis, his so-called beautiful family, dropped him like a radioactive stone. His calls went entirely unanswered. Within a month, Chloe cut a ruthless deal with the prosecutors. She testified entirely against him to avoid accessory wire fraud charges. She admitted, on the record in her sworn deposition, that Sterling had deliberately and specifically targeted me. He thought my desperate financial situation with Maya made me too vulnerable, too distracted, and too compliant to ever question the massive sums of money moving rapidly through my account. He had the moral compass of a starving seagull. Sterling was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. He was ordered to pay massive financial restitution to the vendors he had skimmed from. His closet of custom Italian suits was permanently replaced by standard-issue, poorly fitting khaki jumpsuits. As for me, the federal authorities cleared my LLC completely within a week. The meticulous forensic metadata evidence I provided proved unequivocally that I was an unwitting victim, a blind conduit, not a willing co-conspirator. I never shot another wedding. 3 months after Sterling went away, Maya finally had her bilateral cochlear implant surgery. The money to pay the hospital didn't come from shooting drunken groomsmen. It came from a massive, rapid civil settlement Sterling's parent insurance company paid out to me to avoid a highly public, highly damaging lawsuit over the physical assault at the beach club and the documented defamation of my business. The day they turned Maya's external processors on in the audiologist's office is a day that is permanently, deeply etched into my soul. The clinic smelled of sterile alcohol swabs and warm electronics. The doctor, a kind woman with gentle hands, pressed a sequence of buttons on her laptop. A low electronic hum filled the room. Maya was sitting nervously on the crinkly paper of the examination table, tightly clutching her frayed, stuffed dog to her chest. "Maya," I said softly, my voice trembling, tears already prickling the corners of my eyes. She blinked. Her body went completely rigid. Her brown eyes went wide, darting around the small room. She looked at the doctor, confused by the sudden influx of sensory data, and then she turned her head and looked directly at me. A massive, beautiful, overwhelming smile broke across her face. She dropped the stuffed dog. She didn't raise her hands to sign. For the very first time in her life, she took a deep breath and tried to use her own vocal cords. It was a raspy, quiet, clumsy little sound, unpracticed and perfect. "Daddy," she whispered. I broke down. I completely fractured. I fell to my knees by the examination table, buried my face in my scarred, calloused hands, and cried until I couldn't physically breathe. Every single humiliation in that bakery, every cruel word whispered by Chloe, the freezing night on the loading dock, the bleeding hands on the marble floor, the suffocating, paralyzing terror of failing her, it all washed away, draining out of me onto the linoleum floor of that tiny, quiet room. We live in a small, warm house near Lake Nokomis now. It's quiet. The floorboards don't squeak, and the radiators don't hiss. I took a full-time job as a staff photographer for a regional nature magazine. It doesn't pay luxury, private estate money, but it pays more than enough to keep us warm and safe. I spend my days walking slowly through dense green state parks, smelling the pine needles and the damp earth, taking pictures of herons taking flight and old oak trees. Things that don't lie, things that don't wear expensive masks. Last Sunday, I was sitting on my back porch with Grandpa Leo. He's much older now, moving a little slower, his hands resting heavily on his cane. The summer air was thick and sweet. Maya was running wildly in the green grass of the yard, laughing a loud, joyous, musical laugh as she chased a yellow swallowtail butterfly. The sleek external processors of her implants caught the bright afternoon sun, gleaming like tiny, precious jewels behind her ears. Leo took a slow sip of his bitter black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. He watched Maya running in circles, then slowly turned his head and looked at me. "Told you," he murmured, a slight, deeply satisfied smile touching the weathered corners of his mouth. "Let the oil soak." "You were right, Grandpa," I said, leaning back in my wooden chair, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The metal yielded. I reached down and picked up my camera. I didn't point it at a stressed, screaming bride. I didn't point it at a cruel, arrogant billionaire. I pointed the lens at my daughter, laughing freely in the tall grass, and I gently pressed the shutter. Click. Perfect framing.